Hello ladies and gents, welcome to another video. Today I want to teach you how to solder a QFN chip onto a motherboard quickly and easily. So QFN stands for Quad Flat No Leads, and it is also a surface mount chip, i.e. the solder pads are on the bottom of the chip instead of having solder legs like the chips used to have. So this in front of us is a M92T36. It's a power management IC for a Nintendo Switch, and I thought it would be a perfect example of how to solder a QFN chip, because if we take a closer look at the chip itself, you'll see that there are several components around the area which could cause an issue if you're new to soldering. So one thing that we see quite a lot in the console repair business particularly, especially on the Nintendo Switch, is the three capacitors at the top of the chip always tend to get bridged. So when people are soldering the chip, they tend to bridge these three capacitors with solder, and it can be quite tricky to unbridge them, especially considering these are quite small components. So I thought this would be a perfect example, and we're going to show you how to remove the chip first of all. Now this chip has already been removed in the past, so it does have leaded solder, so the temperatures may be a little bit different to lead-free solder, which is what you would typically get if a motherboard has never been messed with and it's come straight from factory. So the process is pretty much the same, but the temperatures may vary. So right now my temperature is set to 440 degrees Celsius and I have an airflow speed of 40%. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to try and remove the chip as safely as I possibly can by first of all just spreading some heat around the board. And then once the board's a little bit warm, I'm going to come in with a pair of tweezers and I'm going to grab onto the chip. Now I'm not going to pull up on the chip, I'm going to wait until the solder is molten. We're going to see the solder go a little bit shiny, and it may be a little bit duller if you're removing a component that has lead-free solder. But as you can see, the chip just started to move and it's ready to lift off now, and now we have a blank canvas to work with. So now what we want to do is we want to remove all of the old solder, especially if it's lead-free solder, from the board, and we want to replace that with leaded solder, so nice fresh leaded solder. So the substance that I'm adding right now is flux, and there are several different types of flux you can get. I use Kingbo RMA 218, and the way I see it is flux is generally flux, and as long as you clean the board afterwards, it shouldn't really make much of a difference which brand you're using. And I believe there are several videos doing comparisons on different types of flux, and they all turned out to be roughly the same in terms of the end result. So what I want to do now is clean up the board, like I said, and to do that I'm going to use the soldering iron and some wick. Wick is basically a braid of copper, and when added with flux it makes the removal process of the old solder very easy indeed, because the solder will always follow the heat, and as it's following the heat it will get sucked up onto the copper and it will stay there, leaving us with nice clean pads to work with. So I'm going to take my soldering iron, and the soldering iron I'm using right now is a TS100, and I have the modified firmware, which means I'm using 450 degrees Celsius heat. But if you are using a different soldering iron, your mileage may vary. But what I'm going to do is, once the soldering iron has heated up, I'm just going to wick away at the pads and remove the solder. So I'm going to go with the direction of the pads. So these ones are going up and down, so that's the way I'm going to go with the wick. And I'm just going to remove all of the old solder from the pads. So just gentle wicking, not too hard, we don't want to pull any pads, although restoring pads on a QFN chip is a video for another day. And you'll notice I'm still going with the direction of the pads. You don't have to go up and down, you can just slide once or twice. And then we also want to clean the middle pad as well. This is a ground pad, and this serves multiple purposes. One, it's going to assist in heat transfer. So basically what's going to happen is there's a pad on the chip as well, and that pad is going to suck up some of the solder, make a connection between this pad here and the chip, and that's going to assist in transferring heat from the chip and into the ground section of the board. And the reason for this is to save having to put heat sinks on the chips themselves. So it serves as a method to transfer heat, so sort of like a heat sink, but it's also going to assist us in soldering as well. And the reason for that is because when we've got some fresh solder on here, it's going to center the chip for us and make our life a million times easier. We want the chip to be as flat to the board as possible, but we also want to make it as easy as possible to be able to solder the new chip onto the board. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to a bigger tip, and the reason for that is because the thermal mass of the center pad is much larger than the smaller soldering pads that we have on here. So I'm going to switch to a much bigger tip, and as you can see, this is a very large tip. This is overkill, but I absolutely love it. It's an amazing tip to use, especially for wicking, and especially for wicking big ground pads. So I'm going to suck up this solder. And I'm going to let the heat transfer. And then I'm just going to start rubbing up and down on the ground pad until the solder is completely removed. And that's going to allow me to clean that area and basically create a nice working space to solder the new chip. Next, we want to clean the burnt flux away from the area. So the flux that's there at the minute we want to get rid of. So we just use some isopropyl alcohol and a cotton swab. If you do want a much cleaner working area, you can use a toothbrush, and that's going to allow the bristles to get in between all of the gaps on the surrounding components and remove pretty much all of the flux from that area and all of the debris and foreign objects. So I'm going to use a toothbrush with some isopropyl alcohol, and then I'm going to just give it a good scrub, and that's going to clean the board properly and make sure that we've got no excess flux on the board. And because this is isopropyl alcohol, eventually will evaporate itself. You will see it start to evaporate while I'm talking, but what I like to do to assist in the evaporation process and speed up the repair process, I use hot air and just blow hot air across the isopropyl alcohol. That's going to make it evaporate quicker. And as you'll notice here, the isopropyl alcohol has evaporated from this area here, but we still have some here. And I'm going to blow across that to get rid of the excess isopropyl alcohol. So I'll just use my hot air again and just blast it with a quick blast of air. And now, as you can see, we've got a nice clean working space. So now that we have a clean area, what I want to do is I want to change over to the tip that I was using earlier on. So this is a much smaller tip, and the tip that you use is going to be determined by what you're trying to solder. So this may take a little bit of getting used to. Without knowing exactly what you're trying to solder, I cannot tell you what tip is the best tip to use. So I generally use 2 or 3 different tips, and this is one of the main tips that I use for QFN soldering. And the reason for that is because it's got good heat transfer and it's nice and small. So I'm going to add some fresh flux to the area. And a bit in the middle as well, because like I said, we do want to add some more solder to the middle pad. And now I'm going to get some fresh leaded solder. So leaded solder is much better than lead-free solder. It's more durable and it has a lower melting temperature than lead-free. The factories use lead-free because it's now illegal in most countries to use leaded solder, but as long as you've got relevant fume extraction, you will be fine. I don't generally use fume extraction, and a lot of people on my live streams tend to go mental at me for it, but it's just something that I do. I can never be bothered to set up the fume extractor. I know it's bad for me, I understand that, but you know, that's a personal choice, and I do recommend that everybody else uses it. So let's zoom in so you can see the pads a little bit better now. So I'm using a microscope here, obviously, and a microscope is always going to be better. If you don't have a microscope, you can download a free app off the Google Play Store for an Android phone called Cozy Magnifier, and then if you get a cheap stand, you can turn your phone into a cheap microscope. if you also get a HDMI converter for your phone, you can put that onto a big screen and you've got a nice cheap microscope to work with. It's especially nice if you're just getting into the game and you don't want to invest too much money while you're practicing. So next what I'm going to do is I'm going to pre-tin these solder pads. So what that means is I'm going to pre-apply solder onto these pads here, all the way around, making sure that they're nice and even, and then also a little blob of solder in the middle, and that's going to allow me to solder a new chip nice and easy. So I'm going to take my soldering iron and I'm going to pre-apply some solder onto the tip of the iron, so not too much, and then I'm just going to run across all of these pads, and that's going to pre-apply solder onto them as the heat is transferring over to them. So I'll just use the drag method for this. So that's basically where I'm going to start from the top. I'm going to drag all the way down and then all the way back up, and it should apply a nice even layer of solder on each of these pads without causing any bridges, because we've got flux there to help us with the solder flowing. And there you go. So one continuous movement and we have a nice even layer of solder all the way across. Now one thing you may want to do, especially when you're starting to learn soldering, is to turn the board around so as you're more comfortable. So I'm left-handed, so the soldering iron is always going to be coming from my left-hand side. But if you're right-handed, then it may be different. It just depends what you're comfortable with. Once again, I'm going to drag across. Nice even layer. Turn the board around. And again, drag across. We can prevent it from going on the middle pad too much by lifting the soldering iron up a little bit, but that's going to basically reduce the heat transfer. But once again, turn the board around. And there you go. As you can see, every single pad there is nicely soldered. It did go a little bit out of focus there. I do apologise about that. But now I'm going to clean my tip, so I've got a nice clean tip here. And now I can remove this tip and I'm going to pop on the bigger tip that I was just using to allow me to flow the solder on the middle pad. So once the soldering iron has heated back up, I'm just going to apply some heat to the board. And that's going to mix all of the solder and put it into one nice blob in the middle. As you can see there, that's nice and even now, and that's absolutely perfect. That is just what we're looking for. Okay, and now we're ready to apply a new chip onto the board. But what we do want to do first is just clean off the board, so we've got a nice clean working space and nice fresh flux to work with. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit so you can see. We can clean off the board one of two ways. We can use isopropyl alcohol and a cotton swab, or we can use the toothbrush. I prefer to use the toothbrush wherever possible, and the reason for that is because it allows me to get a much deeper clean and make sure it's as clean as I can possibly get it. So I'm just going to give the board a quick scrub with isopropyl alcohol and the toothbrush. Just get rid of any of that excess flux off there. And then I'm going to blow away the excess isopropyl alcohol using hot air once again. Just like that. Okay, so let's zoom back in so we can see a little bit better. And as you can see, we've got some nice uniform pads there. They all look great. And what we want to do now is we want to make sure that the chip that we're installing is in the correct orientation. And there are a couple of ways that we can determine which way it's meant to go. The easiest way is to look on the board. Usually we've got some sort of indication, and in this case it's in the form of a triangle, and this is basically a big sign saying, look at me, I go this way. And then if we take a look at the chip itself, we have a dot on the chip. So this is basically a process that's used by the machines, and the machine will look for this specific indicator. It will look for the indicator on the chip. That's usually pre-programmed, and it basically tells the computer which way the board is facing and also which way it needs to solder or drop the chip onto. And that's also useful for us as well. So we just line up the dot with the indicator on the board. If there is no dot on the chip itself, or if there's no indicator on the board, then you may need to look up images online. We do need to make sure that it is in the correct orientation. If you're using a second-hand chip like I am here, then we can generally see where the chip needs to go. So we can see that it's in line there, and if we tilt the board and the chip at the same time, it may be a little bit difficult to see, but you should be able to see where the lines are on the chip itself. There are usually pads on the side of the chip as well, and that basically allows us to solder and make a decent connection on the bottom of the pad as well as on the side to complete the joint. So what we want to do is we want to get this roughly in line. It doesn't have to be perfect. If you have unsteady hands like me, don't panic. I have very unsteady hands. As you can see, I'm struggling to keep it still even now, and I'm only keeping it still when I'm pressing with my hand on the table itself. So what I want to do now is I want to apply a little bit of hot air to basically tack this chip into position, and by doing that it's going to allow me to let it go and allow this to solder properly once I apply some flux. So you'll notice I'm not applying flux for this part, and the reason for that is because I just feel like it's a waste, and basically as soon as we start to apply hot air it's just going to blow it out the way anyway. So for the tacking process I just use the bare board, the chip and a set of tweezers. So I've got my airflow set to 40% and my hot air is set to 440 degrees Celsius, and I'm just going to start coming in, waving some hot air around, get some heat into the board, and eventually I'm going to drop this chip. And you can see now that the chip is not moving, and the reason for that is because it's tacked down in position, and if we give that a tap now you'll see the board will move with it. And the reason for that is because, like I said, it is basically soldered, it's just not soldered properly. So we need to solder it properly now, so we're going to apply some fresh flux. And then I'm going to come in with the hot air once again. Spread the hot air around to start with. And then I'm going to centre the hot air and focus just on the chip. And it should put itself into line. If we give the chip a tap, you'll see that it moves back into place. So that is in position. It's nicely soldered, centred. And I just messed up. I knocked the chip before it went molten again, so I'll do that again. And now you can see that this chip is indeed soldered. So what I want to do now is I want to apply some fresh flux once again, just around the edges. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some pressure on the chip itself, and the way I'm going to do that is I'm not going to use the tweezers and push down with the point. I'm going to put the tweezers nice and flat, and I'm going to focus a lot of the pressure on this side of the chip, and the reason for that is because we've got a very small component just here, and if I apply pressure to this side of the chip, or more so to this side of the chip, it's going to push the solder out the other way. So I'm going to apply pressure, I'm going to come back in with the hot air, be careful not to burn yourself, and I'm going to push down on the chip, and then wait for it to settle. And then I'm going to do the same again and push down this side now. Now that we've pushed most of the solder out, we can do this side and make sure it's nice and flat. So a bit more pressure, hot air. And that chip should now be nice and flat onto the board. And as you can see, the chip may have a couple of scratches, but it's not damaged. So we don't have any big holes in the chip, and the chip is going to survive. So let's apply some fresh flux to the board now. And now what I want to do is I want to solder every single edge of this chip, make sure that every single pad is nicely soldered, and then we've got some nice uniform joints on each side of the chip. So I'm going to use the tip that I was using earlier on. I'm going to zoom in on the chip now so we can see it a little bit clearer. And then I'm going to run the edge of the soldering iron across the edge of the chip. Making sure that I'm actually touching the pads with the soldering iron. And that's going to resolder the joints and make them all nice and shiny, make them all uniform, make sure we've got no dry joints or things like that. And it's going to make sure that the chip is soldered correctly. So now, like I said earlier, make sure that you're comfortable, turn the board around, work with whichever orientation you feel most comfortable. I'm left-handed, so the soldering iron is always going to come in from the left-hand side for me. And same again for that side, just run the soldering iron across. You may have to do a couple of passes. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because the smaller components are around this area. This is where I tend to see a lot of people mess up. We want to be careful here not to knock any components, especially if we're just learning. For me, it's not so bad because I'm used to it, but for a beginner it might be a little bit scary if you knock a tiny 2mm component out of the way. So again, we're going to run the soldering iron across very gently, make sure that those joints are nice and uniform. And now we're going to focus on this side. This side is a little bit more tricky than the rest of them because we have a tiny component here. This is a 2mm component and it's very easy to knock this out. And if it's a capacitor, if it's this small, don't panic, because it's not going to hurt the operation of the machine. A capacitor that small is not going to make a difference when we've got so many other capacitors on this particular line. So I'm going to do the same again. I'm going to be a little bit more careful trying not to knock the component, but if I do, then I'll deal with it afterwards. So I'll just run the iron again. And as you can see, as I get to this side, I kind of get stuck. So I'll just lift the iron up and just work from the other side. And as you can see, I did indeed knock that component. Like I said, I'm not worried, but you may be. One little way you can do it if you do knock a component is you can use the soldering iron. You can use hot tweezers, you can use hot air. If you use hot air, with the position that's in right now, that's just going to flow itself straight back into place. I'm just going to move that back into place like that. And that's actually making a connection now. And that's resoldered. So it's not too difficult to put them back. You may struggle, but if you do knock a component that small, like I said, as long as it's not a resistor, or it's not a transistor, or something important, then it should generally be fine. If it's just a small capacitor, don't worry about it. And that chip is now soldered. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to clean up, and I'm going to inspect the board, make sure that the chip is correctly soldered and that it's perfectly aligned, and then you're pretty much good for testing after that. Now this board in particular is of course dead. It's a donor board. I would never recommend practicing on a working board, but in your case, if you are working on a working board, then you may want to test it afterwards. So I'm just going to clean up and then we'll inspect the joints and make sure that they're all soldered. So again, I'm going to use isopropyl alcohol and a toothbrush. You can also put the board into an ultrasonic cleaner if you have one, but if you're just starting out, you probably don't, which is why I'm doing it this way. But you can put it into an ultrasonic cleaner if you need to. Okay, and finally, once again, I'm going to dry off the area and get rid of any of the additional isopropyl alcohol, just using a bit of hot air. And now we're good to inspect this board. So we're going to tilt it up on an angle, and then we're going to get the microscope in focus. And And as you can see there, we have some very nice joints. All of those joints are nice and shiny. They don't look oxidized, and as we can see, there are also a couple of extra pads on this particular chip. It's not the case with all of them, but if we look here, we've got a pad here which is not in use, and we've got a pad here which is not in use. And if both of these pads are not in use, and they are the only pads that are not in use, then we can be absolutely confident that this chip is dead center. And that's one of the ways that I know whether the M92T36 on a Nintendo Switch is dead center. We'll inspect the other side. Once again, you can see that we've got those unused pads. The rest of the pads are all beautifully shiny and all nicely soldered. Let's take a look at this side. Once again, nice shiny pads, no solder bridges. And let's take a look at this side. Once again, nice shiny pads, no solder bridges. So all of those pads are nice and uniform. Let's zoom in on that one pad just by the capacitor, make sure that there is solder on there. You may struggle to get a bit of solder on there, but as you can see, there is enough on there to make that connection. But you may struggle to get that one particular pad as uniform as the rest because it's so close to that capacitor. But that's not really a concern because I can see that there is more than enough solder on there. And I can also see that the chip is perfectly flat to the board as well, which means that the heat is going to be transferred into the rest of the board and distributed evenly and get cooled adequately. Okay, and that is pretty much that. This chip is beautifully soldered and nothing really went wrong. We did knock one tiny little capacitor, but as you saw, it's pretty easy to get that back into position just using a soldering iron. And if you do that kind of thing, if you do knock a capacitor or something, don't panic, take your time, take a breath, and you will get used to it eventually. And even if you can't fix it at that time, just remove it. If it's just a tiny capacitor, it shouldn't make a difference to the operation of the circuit. But that's going to be for this video. If you do have any comments or questions, leave them down in the comment section down below. I will always do my best to answer every question that I get. If you want to see more soldering tutorials, be sure to give me a thumbs up and let me know. And if you want to see more regular repair videos, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell notifications so that you're notified every time that I upload. I also now have channel members, so if you do want to support this kind of content, you can do so for as little as £1.99 a month. Just click on the join button below the video and you can become a channel member. But that's going to be it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, see you later. Bye for now.